This is Chapter 7, Pillar 3, Discernment. The third pillar for cultivating intuition is the practice of discernment. Discernment, the ability to judge well, might not seem like something we should have to intentionally cultivate. We make deliberate choices all the time. But when we've been raised in a culture that prioritizes objective knowledge and outside authorities, it can be understandably hard to know how to trust our inner subjective knowing. That's where discernment comes in. Discernment is a path of practice that helps us become trustworthy knowers. In this pillar, we'll nurture our intuitive authority so that we develop the confidence to pay attention to and believe in, and therefore act on, our intuitive experience. By learning how and when to trust our intuition, we make it easier to act on intuition. We'll have fewer of those experiences where we only realize in retrospect that we knew or should have known. We develop the authority and agency to know and to be intuitive knowers. Discernment is cultivated by surrendering the often automatic defenses of the thinking analytic mind and by developing an inventory of self-knowledge so that we're able to interpret, understand, and trust what we experience intuitively. We come to know ourselves better by listening within, becoming familiar with our inner voices, memories, symbols, habits, and stories. When we start to pay attention inward, it turns out there is a lot going on in there. I liken this pillar to nurturing a relationship between parts of ourselves, letting some parts get louder while gently quieting others. We put the various parts of ourself, representing different ways of knowing and different approaches to attention, awareness, and keeping us safe, into a working relationship. Discernment is key to a bigger political project about knowing. It requires that we put the person back into the story. Remember that how we understand self matters to our mindset about intuition. There's the self we typically identify as, the person who other people also know, made up of personality, knowledge, memory, and other traits. Then there's the part of us that's connected to all else, not just self, but capital S self. Plus, each of ourselves are subject to the capabilities and limitations our embodiment brings. What we think of as true or valid also matters here. Truth can refer to a static quality that requires everything else to be false, a binary take, or it can be understood in a non dual way that accepts that other things can also be true at the same time. Culturally, we still have work to do to understand the subjective nature of knowledge versus scientific objectivity, especially around the truth and validity of non discursive experience. The Enlightenment's rules for science developed a method of validation that includes repeatability, where different methods or different observers should get the same results. This led to the notion that whatever is true must be universally true. However, as we know, knowledge acquired intuitively can't always be shared between people. Most intuitive experience cannot be confirmed through objective methodologies like double-blind experiments. It often can't be reported, charted, or signified since it relies on the sensory and interpretive functions of each individual for its meaning. This doesn't mean that intuition is not worthy of trust. It just complicates our relationship to inner experience and the way we assess knowledge. Beyond scientism, trusting intuition on its own terms requires us to consider the value and validity of subjective knowledge production when it's deployed in a trustworthy way. Note that I'm not advocating for subjectivism, the idea that every person is an expert of every subject and that just because a person thinks something, it is true. We can't just let any inner awareness stand as intuition. That's a recipe for utter disaster. Even though the requirement for objectivity and knowledge shouldn't apply to intuitive experience, that doesn't mean that anyone can say anything and it's true. That's subjectivism. Besides, something can be true for an individual or true in the moment and still not be universally true. Intuition requires us to have a healthy amount of self-awareness, some expertise in the ways of our own minds. Instinct can function well without self-consciousness, but intuitive knowing depends on a self that is in conscious relationship with itself. From within, individuals can gauge the rightness of their intuition by relying on their intentionally developed personal sense of awareness, discernment, and familiarity with symbolic meaning. The practices in this pillar are oriented around developing a trustworthiness that comes from being self-aware and doing ongoing self-reflection to be able to recognize the difference between intuition and other types of inner experience. Discernment is how we make sense of intuitive content. It's how we interpret what's happening, what it means, and what to do about it. The more we can become self-aware and coherent, the more we recognize information flowing to and through us and are better able to assess what that information means. We can learn to honor what we perceive even when it doesn't yet make sense. Clarissa Pinkola Estes refers to the, quote, unfounded fear that many people feel about following their intuition, especially when it leads to unknown or uncomfortable choices. But that fear is understandable. Listening to intuition is the easier part. The effort is in following up on its wisdom. Often, the best thing we can do is to maintain a stance on our own intuition that is uninvested and detached from the outcome. The minute we're too invested, we reduce the capacity to discern. Instead, we try to start from a default of curiosity or even trust, beginner's mind. Discernment develops through the commitment to knowing oneself as authentically as possible and being willing to bear the risk of uncertainty or of knowing something uncomfortable or challenging. Trust is especially required when we are feeling uncertain, but the requirement for belief is minimized by focusing on lived experience. The proof is in the experience. Once we learn how to be in touch with inner experience, we can rely on that. This is not only empowering, it leads to a practical step in cultivating discernment, recognizing intuition when it happens. As we have practiced in Pillar 2, we need to let intuitive experiences happen, to experience our experiences. And as we explored in Pillar 1, all of this is interfered with by beliefs about the trustworthiness of inner experience and stories we tell ourselves about and others about reality, especially when it comes to the non-ordinary realm of psychic experience. One of the major obstacles to intuitive awareness is that we get in our own way with that all too familiar roadblocker, doubt. Since intuition takes place on a level of awareness that exists largely outside of language, in the symbolic and energetic fields of experience, it can be tricky to not interfere by dismissing intuition too quickly. And in the other direction, it's important that we heed intuitive information. In extreme cases, not following our intuition can put us in danger or even make us sick when what we're refusing to let ourselves know settles into the body and becomes a tension pattern, inflammation, or irritation, a disturbance with potential to become disease. But it's important to realize that discernment is different from doubt. If our goal is to enhance intuitive capabilities, we do not want to get caught up in thinking about intuition. We can get in our own way if we're too concerned with trying to understand what is happening when intuitive experience occurs. Instead, we need to welcome the non-rational, non-discursive experience as such, even if we don't quite understand what's going on. Trusting our intuition involves accepting uncertainty and complexity as inherent features of reality. It helps to cultivate a willingness to consider things that might seem absurd or impossible at first. It also helps if we're willing to perceive the world as more profound than we often allow, more complex than we can even imagine, and more interconnected than we typically let ourselves perceive. If we expect this complexity and nonlinear unfolding, it is easier to trust. The mindset pillar helps us orient to this understanding. The discernment pillar helps us to put this perspective into practice. Connecting to our intuitive self. Trusting the experiences that make up intuition means we must be present to our lived experiences, even those we don't immediately understand or those we don't like. If we have distanced ourselves from trusting our intuition, we will have constructed barriers to a range of other authentic human experience as well. In other words, disconnection from intuition is a symptom of wider disconnection from experience. This disconnection is not a personal failing. It's baked into our culture, manifesting as anxiety and self-doubt. I often use the word alienation to describe this experience, to suggest that our disconnection from intuitive experience is a result of internalized cultural factors, not a personal limitation. Alienation from intuition often takes the form of a fear that we can't tell the difference between intuition and anxiety, or intuition and imagination. We worry that it's all in our heads. Is that creepy crawly feeling a weird manifestation of stress? Or is it a whisper that we should be paying more attention? Most of all, how do we tell the difference? Psychic intuitive experiences are particularly troublesome. Are they real? Can you trust them? Are you a weirdo for having them? The answers to these anxieties lie in paying attention over time. First, we need to be aware of our inner responses to situations and remember that it's possible to connect what we feel in that moment to a manifest outcome. Specifically, we can learn to recognize our own intuitive tells. From this point of view, cultivating discernment is like cultivating a relationship between parts of ourselves that may only usually communicate through dreams or visions, if at all. We can strengthen this relationship by accepting that non-discursive awareness exists and is real. We can send an internal memo that it is meaningful, even if the meaning is not translatable through words. This acceptance goes a long way towards inviting more of this type of experience. So many of us do not feel confident in our ability to hear the inner voice, let alone trust what it has to say. We generally know there is a thing called intuition and that it is supposed to be valuable, but we're limited in how much we rely on it. We don't feel connected to it or recognize it as an important personal factor. To be fair, there is a lot in the way. Our own biases, including a lifetime of belief and messaging about what consciousness can and cannot do. The habit of focusing our attention outside ourselves for knowledge and information, and the internalized assumption that that's where knowledge is to be found. Anxiety, fear, disengagement, and disconnection from our own inner experience. And the habit of seeking comfort and simplicity rather than accepting complexity as a feature of lived experience. Discerning validity through self-awareness. The binary concept of right and wrong can be paralyzing. If I make a wrong choice, I have messed up, so I might not be willing to do the thing. I won't make that unconventional, surprising, inconvenient move because the risk is too great. But once we have integrated the concept of both and non-duality, how might we then discern validity? This question becomes especially interesting when trying to discern precognition or foreknowledge. How is it possible to trust that we know something that hasn't yet happened? We can keep in mind that within the multiple planes of reality that exist simultaneously, such as in the implicate and explicit orders, something can be right and wrong at the same time. Something might be correct or true in the physical, immediate, explicit plane, but not so in the cosmic implicate order. Newtonian physics comes to mind. Discernment is supported by remembering that matter is more accurately understood as an event or a field of energy than a static thing. So whether we're talking about an object, an awareness, or information, it's more accurately a coherence of probability with expandable and permeable boundaries than real in the concrete sense. In many cases, rightness is context dependent. Something can be true for you and not universally true. Not everything that can be known is for everyone to know. We have to become more comfortable with this ambiguity as we transition from a binary duality mindset to an inclusive, open, non dual one. The question of how to know if an intuitive awareness is correct is sometimes a matter of personal ethics. Here, we encounter the deeply subjective nature of intuitive experience. For example, the truth being revealed to you could be arising from your biases, the distortion your beliefs place on your perception, or a result of your unquestioned or perhaps even false assumptions. We believe a lot of things without realizing it, and these can add up to implicit bias, basically a distorted worldview built on inaccurate and unexamined assumptions. The idea that knowledge should or can be neutral and that it somehow exists outside of or despite the people who use it is a fallacy. Intuition depends on the person, you, the subject, for its value. It does not work without us, since awareness is filtered through each person's lens and life. Intuition is influenced by personality, environment, and experience. So the way subjective experience becomes trustworthy is through intentional self-awareness practice, where at the very least you become an expert of your own experience. The difference between self-knowledge and self-awareness is relevant here. Self-knowledge implies that there is a self to know, a particular, consistent, essential kernel of individuality, usually understood to be comprised of ego, personality, and unconscious. This framing of self is misleading. For one thing, we are not individually constituted as selves, but are intricately interconnected to our context and to and through other beings. For another, we are dynamic, changing beings, always in flux, so there is no permanent selfness to know. Self-awareness is more comfortable for me. It's more easily framed as a practice rather than as a destination or goal. Self-awareness, built on the assumption that the self is a dynamic construct, must be continually undertaken. It's a stance or process rather than an endpoint. Self-awareness includes awareness of the body, of thoughts, of relationships, ethics, of actions, of energy, of input, of output, all the processes that cumulatively comprise one's self. Self-awareness is always ongoing work. Intuitive experiences can be difficult to trust, just as they can be difficult to perceive, because intuition is largely an unconscious process, and our self-awareness on that level tends to be extremely subtle and unpracticed. As we change and develop, our perceptive awareness also changes, and we flow through times of more and less accessible intuition. We make intuitive decisions or decisions we know are against our best interest, learn from them, and get feedback on and additional knowledge about our intuitive perception and how it works for each of us individually. Trust versus doubt. Earlier, we looked at how an emphasis on doubt has seeped thoroughly into our culture. Collectively, we tend to value doubt over trust, and the habit of doubt has been internalized. Think about all the ways you don't trust yourself now, all the ways you might not trust the world and its ability to support you. In some sense, a lot of this mistrust is absolutely justified. Living under a regime of colonial capitalism, we are profoundly disconnected from natural cycles, from our instincts, and from the impulses to nurture sustainable ways of living. After a lifetime of experiencing disconnection from inner experience, it's understandable if you don't inherently trust your inner knowing. As an academically trained philosopher and theorist, I have to admit that a part of me is reluctant to argue that truth is to be found in our subjective experience. This position can be weaponized as truthiness or subjectivism, making it seem that objective reality is not real. But there's a difference between subjectivity and subjectivism. Subjectivism is where the concept of shared reality is totally dismissed. Subjectivity recognizes that we each read the world through our own unique experience. And subjectivity is necessary if we want to have a reliable connection to the intuitive aspects of our nature. Am I suggesting that intuitive awareness doesn't conform to the same standards of knowledge we typically require for something to be true? Yes. Yes, I am. But I'm not trying to promote the idea that rationality and reason don't matter. Rationality and reason are wonderful, hard-won, and evolved abilities, but they shouldn't simply replace inner knowing, also hard-won, because of a bias that it's a lesser form of knowing. Intuition and analysis are not binary. They're complementary and interconnected, supporting each other in a complex and holistic process, recursively informing each other. They are part of a skill set that makes good decisions and that creates and comprehends knowledge. One of the internalized habits of the scientific paradigm is the search for certain knowing. There is the idea that if something is true, it will always be true across any context, no matter who is perceiving. But this fallacy has been dismantled many times. For example, take the practice of medicine. We now know that women tend to experience symptoms and syndromes differently from men. This is true with heart attacks, diagnoses of neurodiversity, the experience of pain, and many other things. And that's just one possible category of difference. Within an intellectual culture embedded in the dominance of analysis, intuition is often subjected to a special kind of heightened interrogation. How can it be true? How do you know it's true? These questions arise from assumptions about knowledge that are based in a positivist, materialist framework. But let's turn that around and view intuition through a transpersonal logic. The truth of intuitive experience relies on a coherent, contextual experience of the person who is intuiting, as opposed to materialist science that requires the subject be taken out of the equation. Truth in this case necessarily depends on the subject. The context and the subject determine what is true and relies on a cared for, self-aware, conscious person. The thing about looking for truth in intuition is that its truth is founded on something other than objective measure. We can't go looking for the truth of intuition with the same standards of truth we use with objective material matters. Scientist principles don't and shouldn't apply. Intuitive truth is subjective. It simply doesn't use the same rules as the reason or logic we're used to. Uncertainty is a fact of our lives. The best theory we have confirms that, at least down at the quantum level. Uncertainty is a fact. Becoming comfortable with uncertainty is an asset when you're working with intuition. With intuitive experience, there's often an element of uncertainty involved. There's the complexity of needing to decipher the meaning of non-discursive content. There's the question of whether we trust ourselves enough to understand the intuitive experience on its own terms. Paradoxically, relinquishing the need for certainty and control creates the opportunity to experience more intuitive certainty, arising from a secure relationship between aspects of ourselves and a quality of trust in intuition. Scientific inquiry typically involves intuition and its uncertainty at some point, whether in the initial creative stage of inventing experimental protocols to investigate a hypothesis, or later in working to interpret findings. Imagine a scientist following up a hunch to try a new procedure or to mix a certain chemical with another one. The alternative to experimental risks and guesses, or as scientists like to call them, hypotheses, is getting mired by uncertainty and letting it cause anxiety. Clinging to security and safety would interfere with creativity and bring the development of new theories and ideas to an end. Let's take an example of an intuitive hit. Imagine you're waiting for an elevator. It arrives, and just before you walk in, something in you registers the message, "Don't go in the elevator, wait for the next one." Let's say you decide to listen to that inner knowing. You let the doors close and wait for the next elevator. Nothing out of the ordinary happens. The car you didn't get on doesn't come to an emergency stop. There isn't a $100 bill on the floor of the car you do get on. There's no discernible reason for the hit. So, was it wrong? In a binary sense, maybe. There was no reasonable reason for you to take the next elevator. So, how do you gauge the correctness of this hit? First, let's remember the subjectivity of the experience. Notice that the hit didn't tell you about any danger. That's a layer of implication you might have drawn based on your experience, your assumptions, your fears, etc. Then we can apply an intuitive logic. Within the old paradigm, we expect an intuitive hit to be right or wrong. Either there is a reason to not go in that elevator or there isn't. In the new paradigm, with the both and logic of indeterminacy, it's impossible to say that your intuition was incorrect, since we can never know what didn't happen. There's no way of knowing whether there was a reason to steer clear of that first elevator car. We have to choose to trust that it's valuable to listen, even if we never know why. Advocating for trusting intuition is not the same as suggesting that we completely give up the analytic way of knowing, nor the cognitive approach to perception. Not at all. I'm not advocating for scientists to quit measuring and triangulating the results and instead follow their hearts. Nor do I think any of us should quit thinking for the sake of intuition-driven living. Our ancestors worked hard to develop the analytic abilities we rely on, and they're our birthright. But I am advocating for being more intuitive. This is not either you're intuitive or you're analytic. We're all capable of being both, and we need to accept this. Analysis is also always an imperfect translation. It is never a capture of the thing itself, but it is always in some way mediated, whether through judgment, assessment, reason, or thinking. All secondary processes that take place after intuition or sensation provides the input. Here's an example of using intuition versus a rational mode to make a decision. Let's say I want to decide where to go on vacation. I can gather a list of features about each of these places and evaluate which one checks the most dream vacation boxes. I can make a list of pros and cons to sort out all the reasons each location is a good choice. I can consult with friends, do research, or call a travel agent to get input about the best deals. These would be the analytic approaches. Or I can consult with my body, checking in about how each of the options feels to my sensorium and nervous system. I can use any number of divination tools, dowsing, tarot, scrying, to invite the unconscious to participate in the decision-making process using its communicative methods. These intuitive approaches rely on senses, colors, shapes, feelings, and vibe, rather than language or metrics. Both decision-making processes can work. Either is a valid approach to decision-making. But used in collaboration, they can become even more reliable. Intuitive and rational modes can act as checks for each other. One choice might look good on paper, but cause a constrictive feeling in the belly, a clear tell that the intuitive mode is communicating its dissent in its non-rational way. Interpreting and acting on intuition. There's a moment in the intuitive process where we have to allow the experience to happen without trying to analyze or comprehend it. It's important to avoid the urge to represent the experience to ourselves prematurely. When experimenting with our own intuitive abilities, we can become better at simply paying attention and noticing the experience before evaluating, judging, attaching language, applying concepts, or assigning a category to the experience. In this way, a focus on the experience itself can lead to immediate, direct perception of the world we are attending to. But then we have to not only let ourselves feel those, admittedly sometimes weak signals, we also have to recognize them as intuitive and then feel authorized and liberated enough to take that awareness seriously. There comes the time to make sense of the experience, a process of discernment that improves with intentional practice of self-development and self-awareness, paying attention to who you are, how you show up, what you do, the tender and tricky aspects of yourself, your blind spots, your habits, your fears. The reason we develop a practice of self-awareness is so that we can decipher what the unconscious communicates and what it means to us. We might be used to thinking about the unconscious as inherently pathological or suspicious, but the unconscious is not necessarily what's repressed. It's merely what is unknown or yet unknown. The psyche is a storehouse of fears, shadow elements, perversions, desire, and collective pain. It's also rich in symbolic meaning, archetypes, depths, and wisdom. Psychologists and philosophers in the transpersonal tradition, like Stanislav Grof and Abraham Maslow, have urged us to depathologize the psyche, to frame it as a source of health and creativity rather than of darkness or illness. Grof reframes the experience of hearing too much from the psyche as a spiritual emergency rather than as psychological breakdown. Often, psychological dis-ease is the result of not being adjusted to aspects of society. There's nothing inherently wrong, just a mismatch. Ideally, such maladjustment alerts the rest of us to problems with society itself and the ways we are collectively organizing ourselves and relating to each other and the larger world. It's not that there is a problem with the individual person. There's a problem with the way we've structured our communities and societies. The purpose of an examined life, the foundation of psychological maturity, is to engage in the process of working to make the unconscious conscious. And for me, this points directly to the self-awareness work of discernment. Cultivating intuitive awareness is inherently tied to this process of development, as the emergence of mature self-authority lets us trust in our own psyche. The transpersonal worldview is helpful here. Attending to what is through non-judgmental awareness primes our attention to notice what's happening. This practice might help us learn what a feeling feels like in the body, in the psyche, or both. This is not only about intuition, but about how we inhabit ourselves in our everyday lives. For example, many of us hold stress in the body. The shoulders, neck, and jaw are notorious for this. Oftentimes, simply noticing this tension starts the process of releasing it. But now we recognize that the body holds information. All experience is stored in the body, including the stuff that happened to our ancestors. It might become possible to identify if the stress isn't our own, but something picked up from the collective. Or it might be ours, but from a long time ago, the result of a stressful experience now past. We might be experiencing something today that simply needs to be expressed so that it can move on, move through. With attention and self-awareness, we can learn to discern what needs to be worked on and what needs to be worked out. This means figuring out our feelings and following them rather than what many of us do, run away from them. It means engaging in self-inquiry to find out more and staying curious about our experience, even when, especially when, it is difficult or challenging. Thanks for watching the DIY audiobook of What is Intuition, Resonance, Connection, and Trusting Intuition on its own terms. Make sure you listen to the